You stand in the Alcazar of Madrid, where air and incense are thick enough to choke. The scent of wax and roses hides the blood seeping beneath the chamber door. You hear her, the queen's scream, echoing through the vaulted corridors. In this palace of saints and spies, something holy is being born, or something cursed. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. History like this doesn't just live in dusty books, it lives in us. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Lahore, Lisbon, Manila, Madrid? The thought that we can share one story, one heartbeat across oceans and centuries, that is its own kind of empire. If you feel it too, lend this video a like, subscribe, and join the circle of curious minds keeping the past alive. Now, let the story begin. October 1661. The bells of Madrid toll for joy. Inside the royal chamber, Queen Mariana of Austria lies pale against her linen sheets, her hands clutching a crucifix slick with sweat. The midwives whisper prayers to the Virgin as thunder rattles the palace windows. Beyond the door, courtiers kneel in anticipation. The fate of an empire rests upon the wailing of an infant. When the child finally comes, silence falls. The queen's confessor crosses himself and murmurs, "Deo gratias." But even he hesitates before approaching the cradle. The newborn's skin is waxen, his jaw oddly slack, his head too large for his fragile neck. Charles. They name him after a line of kings stretching back to Charlemagne, but his cry, thin and uncertain, sounds more like a ghost recalling its life than a life just begun. From the beginning, his existence is both triumph and omen. He is the son of Philip Fear of Spain and Mariana of Austria, uncle and niece. Their marriage was meant to preserve the divine blood of the Habsburgs, to keep the empire within its own circle of grace. Yet the circle had tightened too far. In portraits, the family's features fold into each other: bulbous lips, protruding jaws, pallid eyes, beauty fossilized into deformity. To understand the birth of Charles II, one must walk backward through the centuries, through marriages that bound the Habsburgs not to the world, but to themselves. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles taking nieces as wives. Each union sanctified by priests, witnessed by courtiers, recorded in golden ink, and yet, beneath the grandeur, the blood grew sluggish, poisoned by devotion. The logic was almost divine. They believed themselves chosen, set apart. If common blood diluted holiness, then purity meant isolation. "Let others wage war," they said. "You, happy Austria, marry." But each wedding feast was a slow unmaking. Every toast to dynasty was a whisper to death. By the time Mariana gives birth, Spain's power has already begun to wane. The silver galleons from the New World arrive lighter each year. The treasury bleeds gold, the streets fill with beggars, and priests mutter that sin has crept too close to the throne. Yet within the palace, the queen sees none of this. Her devotion is absolute. God will not punish the faithful, she tells her confessor. But God, it seems, has already begun to answer. In the weeks after his birth, Charles sickens. He cannot nurse. He wheezes at night, his tiny chest fluttering like a bird's. The royal physicians swarm about him, prescribing purges and prayers. They anoint him with oil, feed him honey and wine, bleed his infant veins in search of balance. Still, the child's limbs twist unnaturally, his head lolls to one side, and his eyes, one blue, one brown, stare into nothing. Whispers bloom in the corridors. "He is bewitched," the maids say, "a changeling." The courtiers cross themselves twice when they speak his name. Only the queen refuses to waver. She clutches the child to her breast and murmurs lullabies in German. "Mein Engel, mein König, my angel, my king." Beyond the nursery, the Alcazar breathes with secrets. Every tapestry, every relic, every flicker of candlelight is meant to remind those within that this family rules by divine right. But the portraits, painted by Velázquez and his successors, betray the truth. Look closely at the faces on the walls. The same jaw, the same pale eyes, the same fragile beauty passed from one cousin to another until the body itself began to protest. What is a dynasty, if not a wager against time? The Habsburgs had believed themselves eternal. Yet in Charles's birth, eternity looks like decay. Physicians record every anomaly in careful Latin: prognathismus gravis, severe underbite, sterilitas potens, likely infertility. They do not dare to tell the queen that her son's bloodline is a closed circuit, that the empire's future has been born already dying. And yet, to those who gazed upon the infant prince, there was still awe, for in him lay the full weight of Europe's power, the crowns of Spain, Austria, Burgundy, the Netherlands, and the Americas, all balanced on a skull too fragile to hold them. Ambassadors write home that the prince is delicate but divine, though their ink trembles. The Church declares his survival a miracle. Outside the palace, Madrid continues to burn candles for him. Processions move through the streets, monks chanting for the health of the royal child. In taverns, old soldiers mutter that Spain's glory ended with his father. But no one dares say what everyone feels, that the child of so much blood may one day drown in it. By the end of that winter, the queen kneels once more before the chapel altar, her fingers raw from prayer. Behind her, the cradle creaks softly. The baby stirs, his breath shallow, his eyes glassy with fever. A gust of wind rattles the stained glass and snuffs out a single candle. The queen turns. For a heartbeat, it seems the shadows themselves are whispering. The child will live, but Spain will not. The Habsburg wedding procession wound through Vienna like a golden serpent. Trumpets split the morning air, and the scent of lilies clung to every sleeve. Beneath silken canopies, princes and princesses rode side by side, their faces pale beneath powdered veils. It was not love that joined them, but the architecture of power. And somewhere, in the soft clatter of hooves, history itself seemed to whisper, "This is how empires die, not in war, but in the bedchamber." 2 centuries before the birth of Charles II, Emperor Maximilian I stood at the dawn of this strange alchemy. It was he who declared, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." To his courtiers, it sounded like genius. Why bleed armies when you could conquer with a kiss? So he married Mary of Burgundy, and with her hand came half of Western Europe. Their union was not passion but strategy, the first in a long chain of alliances sealed with bridal crowns instead of helmets. The Habsburgs believed they were chosen instruments of God, guardians of a divine order that stretched from Vienna to Madrid, from Antwerp to Naples. Every wedding was a treaty, every cradle a fortress. Yet in their pursuit of eternal dominion, they began to mistake blood for destiny. If divine right was inherited, then the blood that carried it must never be diluted. And so began the long spiral inward, marriages that bound cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, until the family tree resembled not a branching oak but a crown of thorns. The chapels glowed with ceremony. Organs thundered, incense rolled through the air, and voices rose in Latin hymns. To those in attendance, each wedding looked like triumph. But beneath the silk and the Latin, the same faces reappeared, pale, long-jawed, solemn. The portraits from one generation to the next blur together until only the costumes change. Take Philip II, son of Charles V, whose empire once encircled the globe. When he married his cousin Maria of Portugal, the court called it divine symmetry. Their son was born sickly and small, dead before his first birthday. "God's will," said the priests. Philip married again, first to Mary Tudor of England, his cousin, then to his own niece, Anna of Austria. Each marriage was a prayer disguised as politics, and each child was born carrying the weight of too many ancestors. Listen closely to the language of these alliances. The treaties speak of pure bloodlines, of holy continuance, of marital obedience to providence. They believed the Virgin herself smiled upon these unions. But what they called purity was, in truth, a kind of devotion so blind it turned cruel. In one account, during the wedding of Philip III to Margaret of Austria, both first cousins, the air inside the Escorial chapel grew thick with candle smoke. Witnesses said the bride fainted twice before the vows were done. Yet, when she recovered, she whispered to her confessor, "If our union be a sacrifice, let it be for Spain." It was. Their children bore the stigmata of devotion written into their very bones. By the mid-1600s, the empire's bloodlines had narrowed to a whisper. Philip IV, handsome, melancholic, painted endlessly by Velázquez, looked upon his niece Mariana of Austria and saw not a girl, but the ghost of every treaty his ancestors had ever signed. Their marriage was necessity, not choice. Spain's power was collapsing under debt and disease. Only a child of Habsburg blood could claim legitimacy strong enough to hold the crumbling throne. When they wed, the bells of Madrid rang for 3 days. The streets flooded with petals and the crowd shouted, "Long live the union of Spain and Austria!" No one dared say aloud what every court physician already knew, that such unions had long ceased to bring strength. Mariana was 16. Philip, her uncle, was 44. Their first child died in infancy. Their second was Charles. And so the logic of empire, the logic that began with Maximilian's clever maxim, had reached its grotesque conclusion. The Habsburgs had conquered the world, but they could no longer conquer themselves. Inside the royal archives, marriage contracts are bound in crimson leather. Each is a map of alliances, dotted with wax seals and Latin signatures. Trace them closely and you'll see the pattern form. A spiral, tightening, turning inward until the same names reappear, each generation more fragile than the last. What began as diplomacy had become ritual, and ritual, once emptied of meaning, becomes madness. Yet, to understand them fully, you must remember their faith. The Habsburgs were not cynics. They were believers. They saw in their isolation a reflection of divine purity, a mirror of the Virgin's perfection. To marry beyond the circle was to risk contamination, not merely of lineage, but of soul. It is one of history's cruelest ironies that their very piety ensured their decay. By the time of Philip IV, ambassadors wrote privately of the royal blood being thin as glass. In Vienna, scholars whispered that the line could not last another century. But in Madrid, the priests insisted that God would not forsake his chosen house. So the candles kept burning, the bells kept ringing, and another niece was offered to another uncle, beneath another fresco of angels watching silently from above. As the 17th century waned, Europe began to look upon Spain with pity. The empire that had once devoured continents now seemed hollow, ruled by men who could scarcely stand. Still, the family persisted, wedding itself again and again, chasing the memory of a strength that no longer existed. And in the echo of those endless vows, one truth began to take shape. The Habsburgs had not merely ruled by divine right, they had mistaken themselves for the divine. In a few short years, their final heir will take the throne. His jaw will hang open, his body frail, his mind childlike. But for now, in these glittering cathedrals, the candles still burn, the choirs still sing, and somewhere, deep within the echo of the organ, the blood of empire murmurs to itself, slow, thick, and dying. The boy king stands in the shadow of the Escorial, Spain's granite heart. Wind moans through the corridors like an old prayer, tugging at his robes of gold and black. Courtiers bow, but their eyes avert. His skin gleams with sweat, his lips quiver as he raises a trembling hand in blessing. The gesture is supposed to sanctify an empire, but his fingers will not close. When Charles II becomes king in 1665, Spain is already a ghost of itself. The empire that once swallowed the oceans now cracks from within. The fleets that brought silver from the New World rot in port. The nobles whisper of demons. And in the heart of it all sits a child barely fit to sit upright on a throne carved for conquerors. He is 5 years old and cannot walk without help. His jaw juts forward, his tongue too large for speech. His bones bend like wax. The priests call him El Hechizado, the bewitched. To the people, he is proof that God's wrath has fallen upon the house of Habsburg. To his mother, Queen Mariana, he is both a miracle and a punishment. She keeps him hidden behind silks and icons, whispering to the Virgin that faith will cure what blood has broken. But faith cannot mend what centuries have made. At court, the air itself feels diseased. Candles sputter in the damp air, casting long shadows across the painted faces of ancestors who stare down from the walls, each with the same jaw, the same gaze, the same warning. Courtiers shuffle through rituals of power that no longer convince even themselves. They fight not for Spain's future, but for control over its slow, inevitable decay. When Charles turns 10, his tutors discover he cannot read. He cannot chew his food without choking. His body trembles with fever, his veins blue against the skin. Yet at every Mass, he is paraded before the people as a sign of divine endurance. God preserves him, the priests declare, therefore Spain is preserved. But in the silence after their sermons, the bells toll like a countdown. The physicians bleed him again and again to cleanse the humors. They shave his scalp, apply leeches, recite prayers, and whisper that witches have cursed the royal blood. One, the court doctor Juan de Corral, writes privately that the king's constitution is so weak, his survival must be considered daily a miracle. The miracle, of course, is only that he still breathes. At night, exorcists walk the corridors, sprinkling holy water, muttering in Latin. They claim that the king's afflictions are not of the flesh, but of the spirit. One night, they force him to swallow candles blessed at the shrine of Saint Isidore. When he vomits blood, they praise God for expelling the devil. Outside the palace, famine creeps across Castile. The silver from the Americas barely reaches the ports before vanishing into the coffers of creditors. The empire that once ruled the known world now survives on memory and superstition. Still, Charles endures, his frail body carrying the unbearable weight of history. As he grows, the question of succession becomes an obsession that grips all of Europe. The Spanish crown, with its colonies and treasures, has no heir. Every court, France, Austria, England, watches Madrid with the patience of vultures circling above a dying beast. Ambassadors write in cautious tones, "His Majesty's health remains delicate, but he yet persists." Persist, a word heavy with disbelief. Charles tries, in his own faltering way, to rule. He loves clocks and mechanical birds. He listens to music for hours, his face serene, as though he hears something others cannot. Once he tells his confessor, "My soul feels older than my body." The priest nods, not daring to say aloud that the king's body is barely alive. In his 20s, his hair falls out in clumps. His skin turns yellow. His semen, one physician notes with horror, is like water. 2 marriages bring no children. The queen weeps. The council prays. The empire holds its breath. By the 1690s, the legend of El Hechizado has spread across Europe. Some say he is possessed. Others whisper that he is the devil's mockery of kingship. But those who meet him describe something more tragic. A boy who never learned to be a man, whose kindness flickers through the haze of confusion. "He looked at me as if through a window," writes one envoy, a soul trapped behind glass. In his final years, Charles becomes convinced that witches are draining his strength. He orders the bodies of his ancestors exhumed for exorcism. The priests open the tombs beneath the Escorial, chanting over the bones of kings long turned to dust. The air fills with the scent of rot and myrrh. They say the spirits answered, but not with blessing. Within months, Charles collapses during Mass. On November 1st, 1700, the last Habsburg of Spain dies. He is 38 years old and weighs less than 90 pounds. The autopsy report, preserved in the Royal Archives, reads like an inventory of divine punishment. The body contained no blood. The heart was the size of a walnut, the intestines putrefied, and the head full of water. As his body cools, Madrid falls silent. The court gathers in mourning robes, the air thick with incense and fear. Outside, thunder rolls over the city. Within the hour, messengers ride in every direction. To Paris, Vienna, London, carrying the same message. The king is dead. The Spanish throne is empty. And across Europe, the vultures descend. The War of the Spanish Succession begins, tearing the continent apart. The empire Charles inherited dissolves into hands that never knew its glory. His blood, the last thread of a dynasty that once crowned emperors, ruled seas, and bent continents, seeps into the earth of the Escorial. In the dim light of his crypt, surrounded by the bones of those who created him, the silence is absolute. No choirs, no bells, no prayers, only the faint echo of a promise long broken, that divine blood could make men gods.